All right, so I want you to look up here, and we have y equals sine of x. And so you can see we have the graph of sine. It goes up, down, up, okay? And what we're going to do is we're going to make three different kinds of changes to sine. We're going to put a number up front, okay? We're going to put a number in front of the x on the inside of the angle, and we're going to put a number on the end like a plus or minus, okay? So first thing I want to show you is I want to show you what happens if we put a plus or a minus on the end of the function. Like, let's say instead of having sine of x, we have sine of x plus 1, okay? What I'm going to do is actually, let me go ahead and leave this here, and I'm going to make a new one. I'm going to put y equals sine of x plus 1. You can see here that by adding a plus 1 onto the end of it, what it did was it shifted the whole curve up 1, okay? So where sine was 0, now it's 1. Where it was 1, now it's 2. Where it was negative 1, it's now 0, right? All it did was shift the curve vertically, okay? Well, what if I did minus 1? How about y, or minus 2? How about y equals sine of x minus 2? And we're going to change the color there. Let's make this one maybe green, okay? You can see that the original is in red, and by putting a minus 2 on the end here, it basically just went down 1, 2, every point. The starting point, instead of being at a height of 0, it's at a height of negative 2, okay? And what you can understand here is that the middle of the curve, we call that the midline, okay? So let's turn these off for a second. And the midline of sine of x is at 0, okay? So if I put y equals 0, you can see that line that goes right through the middle there, right? But when we shift up 1 up here, now the midline is at 1. It's now, the whole curve has increased by 1. It's almost as if this blue line here is the x-axis that has shifted up 1, and we're still going up 1 above and 1 below, and we're still hitting the midline when we get to pi, okay? But on this one, where it went down by 2, if we move the midline to negative 2, once again, it's right in the middle. So here's what I need you to understand is that when you plus or minus anything on a sine graph, it'll go up. If it's plus, it'll go up 2, up 3. Okay, it can also go up 4, up 5. Or if you minus, minus 1 goes down 1, minus 2 goes down 2, minus 3 goes down 3. Okay, that's what putting a number on the end does. Now here's the cool thing. It'll do the exact same thing for cosine. So let's say that these were cosine instead of sine. Put the original cosine, there's cosine. All right. Now I believe we started last time when we did cosine, we did it in blue. All right. So here's the original cosine. Well, if we do cosine plus 1, look, it's shifted up 1. Or if we do cosine minus 2, it shifts down 2. And so it does the exact same thing to cosine as it does to sine. It shifts it up or down, the number on the end, okay? All right, now what we're going to do is we're going to look at what happens when we put a number at the beginning of sine or cosine. All right, so I've changed the dimensions of the grid a little bit. Instead of going from negative 3 to 3, I got it going from negative 5 to 5. I want to show you what happens when we multiply sine by a number, okay? So here's sine. It starts at 0, 0, right? It goes up to positive 1, down to 0, down to negative 1, and back up to 0, right? But what happens, let me go ahead and turn on these other ones. What happens if I multiply sine by 2? Okay, well, if I multiply sine by 2, look what it does. It actually increases. This is called the amplitude of the curve. So instead of the highest point being 1, now the highest point is 2. You can basically multiply every one of the points by 2 because that's what's happening. It's 2 times whatever the sine value is, okay? So the highest point is now 2. It still goes through 0, and the lowest point is now negative 2, okay? And then it goes back up to 0, then up to positive 2, and then it would go down to negative 2 again. If we were to make the amplitude 3, if we would do 3 times sine, you would see that it would go up to 3 and then down to negative 3. And so the way that you can calculate the amplitude or the number that goes in front of the sine function is you can basically just start at the top and count how far it is to the bottom. So from here we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? Here's the bottom 6. And so basically what you do is you do the high point, 3, minus the low point, -3. 3 minus -3 is 6, and then divide by 2, and you get a 3, okay? And I'll give you some more examples of that later. So let's go ahead and let's say that if we made it 5, look, it would go all the way up to +5 and down to -5, okay? Now there's one other thing that the amplitude can do, and let me show you that. And that is, okay, so here we have the regular function, is we can put a negative in front of it. What if I made it -2 instead of +2? Well, -2 would basically take your 1 and turn it into a -2. So it does two things. The negative flips over the sine curve. So instead of going up, down, up, the sine curve now goes down, up, down, okay? It starts at 0, down, up, down, or it starts in the middle is a better way of saying it. Then it goes down, up, down, because of that negative. Also, because it's -2, it goes down to -2, then it goes up to +2, and then back to 0, okay? So let's say we were then to make it -4, okay? It would flip it over. Here's the original. It would flip it over so that it goes down first instead of up first. But instead of going down to -1 or -2, it would go down to -4 because there is a 4 in front of the sign. Okay, so it would go down to -4, then back up to 0, then up to 4, and then back down to 0. Okay? And that is what's called the amplitude. So the amplitude is the number that goes in front of the trigonometric function. Now, it'll work the exact same way for cosine. So let's go ahead and put in cosine. There's cosine. Put in cosine here and cosine here. All right. Now, if I were to do 3 times cosine, you can see that it would go from 1 up to 3. Instead of starting at 1, it would start at 3. Then it would go down to -3 again, then back up to 0, and then back up to 3 again. So it starts at 3, down to -3, and up to 3 again. If it was a 5, it would start up at 5, go down to -5, and then back up to 5. In the very same way, if you did a negative, what if we did -4 cosine? Again, it would flip it upside down. Instead of starting at a high point, it would start at a low point. And instead of going down, up, it would go up and then down. And because of the 4, it would start at -4 and it would go up to +4 and then back down to -4. And so that's what the amplitude does. The number in front of the trig function makes it higher and lower, and also if it's negative, it flips it upside down, okay? All right, last thing we're going to do is see what happens when there's a number multiplied by the x in the middle. All right, so the last thing we're going to look at is what happens when we put a number in front of the x, when we multiply a number times x. What it's going to do is it's going to change the angle measure that's being put in. And so ultimately, the name for this is called frequency, okay? So the number that is in front of the x right now is a 1. So when we look at this curve, the normal sine curve, it has a frequency of 1 because the frequency, the number that's in front of the x is 1. Now, let's say that we gave it a frequency of 2, okay? So I could put a 2 in here, and now we compare it to the original. And do you see what it does is it squishes the curve in, okay? But specifically, let me show you what happens, okay? The frequency is the number of times one full cycle of sine occurs between 0 and 2 pi, okay? So here's 0, here's 2 pi. So let me go ahead and put in a couple lines. X equals 0. And x equals 2 pi, okay? And I'm going to put them in as orange, okay? Orange and orange, done. Okay, so between here and here, how many times does sine make a full cycle? And it's one time, so the frequency is 1. But what happens when I go to this one that has a frequency of 2? How many times does sine go up, down, up? How many times does it start at 0, go up to 1, down to -1, and then back up to 0? Well, it does it once, and then starting here, up, down, up again, and stopping at 2 pi, it did 2 full cycles. That means the frequency is 2. Okay, well, what if the frequency was 3? Well, look, it's now even more squished. Up to 1, down to -1, back up to 0. That's once. Up to 1, down to -1, back up to 0. That's twice. Up to 1, down to -1, back up to 0. That's 3 times. Now we're stopped at 2 pi. That means the frequency here is 3, okay? And if we were to do, frequency of 4, let's look at frequency of 4. You can see it's getting even more squished, right? Up, down to -1, then up to 0. That's once. Up, down to -1, and back up to 0. That's twice. Up to 1, down to -1, back up to 0. That's 3 times. Then up to 1, down to -1, and back up to 0. Here's 2 pi. It's done it 4 times. And so therefore the frequency is 4. Now another way you can count the frequency is just between 0 and 2 pi. You can just count how many high peaks there are. There's 1, 2, 3, 4 high peaks. Or you can count the low peaks. 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's a frequency of 4, okay? Now the frequency works the exact same way on cosine, okay? So let's change all of these to cosine. Cosine, cosine, and cosine, okay? So here's the original cosine. Now, the difference is cosine doesn't start at 0. It doesn't go up to 1, then down to -1, then back up to 0, okay? It starts at 1, goes down to -1, and goes back up to 1, okay? And so, how many times does it go from 1 down to -1 and back up to 1? Between 0 and 2 pi. Well, it does it 1 time. Down, up, frequency of 1. All right, well, what if it had a frequency of 2? All right, turn off the original. Let's turn the new one on. 1, down to -1, up to 1. That's once, but we're not at 2 pi yet. We're only at pi. So now, down to -1 again, and then up to +1. That's twice. By the time we get to 2 pi, and therefore the frequency of this cosine function is 2. Okay, so then it would be cosine of 2x. Well, what if it was cosine of 3x? All right, well, it starts at 1, goes down to -1 and up to 1. That's once. Down to -1, up to +1. That's twice. Down to -1 and up to +1 again. That's 3 times. So this has a frequency of 3. The best way to count the frequency of cosine is to count how many extreme points there are that are opposite from the starting point. It started at 1, so we're going to count the negative ones. There's 1, 2, 3 of them between 0 and 2 pi. Therefore, this cosine function has a frequency of 3. Okay? If we were to change it, let's say to, I don't know, let's give it a frequency of of 8. Okay? All right, well, here, look, here's 0, here's 2 pi, we're going to count. Here's a -1, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 of them. Therefore, the frequency of this cosine function is 8. So it would be cosine of 8x, okay? All right, the last thing we're going to do now is we are going to put all 3 of these things together. We're going to put together the midline shift, the up and down shift. We're going to add in amplitude, which is the number at the front, and then we're going to put in frequency. And we're going to see, I'm going to try and teach you how to identify what the trigonometric function is based on its amplitude, based on its frequency, and based on its vertical shift. Okay? All right. I want you to write down these 5 steps in the procedure for identifying the equation of a sine or cosine function. Okay. The first thing you're going to ask yourself is this function a sine or a cosine function? And basically, all you're going to do is look where x equals 0, which is at the y-axis. So go vertically along the y-axis. It's a sine function if the y-axis cuts the curve in the middle of the curve. It's a cosine function if the y-axis touches the curve at the top or the bottom of the curve, okay? And so that's going to distinguish whether you are going to write sin for sine or cos for cosine for the function, okay? Then you're going to ask, is it positive or negative? So is it negative sine or is it positive sine? Does it have a negative in front of it? Or is it a negative cosine or a positive cosine? Well, for sine, at x equals 0, sine is going to be in the middle, of course, but it's going to be moving down instead of moving up if it's negative. Okay, so this is what's happening if it's negative. The normal shape for sine is it's moving up from the middle, but it's negative if it's moving down from the middle at x equals 0, at the y-axis. Now, cosine is going to be negative if at x equals 0, you're at the bottom of the curve instead of the top of the curve. The normal shape for cosine is starting at the top, going down, then up. So if this one is starting at the bottom and going up, then down, then it is a negative cosine instead of a positive cosine. Then you're going to ask, what is the vertical shift? Remember, the vertical shift is going to be a plus or minus on the end of the function, okay? So you're going to go to the middle of the curve, which is exactly halfway between the highest point and the lowest point, okay? And what you want to do is you want to know how far the curve is up or down from y equals 0. Now remember that y equals 0 is the x-axis. So we're also asking how far is it up or down from the x-axis, okay? So if it's, let's say it's the middle of the curve is, let's say, 5 units up from the x-axis, then you would put plus 5. Or let's say the middle of the curve is 3 units down from the x-axis, you would put minus 3. Okay, now we're going to do a couple examples, so don't get too nervous. You know, I'm not just going to leave you with this checklist, okay, or with this procedure. We're going to apply the procedure. All right, then step 4, you're going to ask, what is the amplitude? Remember, the amplitude is the number that goes in front of the function, okay? And what you're going to do is you're going to do the highest point minus the lowest point, and then you're going to divide by 2. So if the highest point of the curve is at 14, and the lowest point of the curve is at 6, you're going to do 14 minus 6, that's 8. Then you're going to divide by 2. 8 divided by 2 is 4. That would mean the amplitude is 4, and you would put a 4 in front of the function, okay? Last thing is you want to know what is the frequency. That's the number that goes inside the parentheses with the x. And the frequency, very simply, is the number of cycles between 0 and 2 pi. So how many times does sine go up, down, up, down, up, down, up? If it does it 5 times or 3 times, let's say it does it 3 times, up, down, up, down, up, between 0 and 2 pi, then the frequency is 3, and you're going to put a 3 inside the parentheses with the x. Okay? So let's go ahead and do a couple examples now. All right, so here we have an example. We have a function. Now look at the grid here. You can see that here's the x-axis right here. Here's the y-axis, and we're counting by ones. We're going up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, down -1, -2, -3, -4, -5. Here's -6 down here. And so the first thing we need to know is this a sine function or a cosine function? Well, if we go to the y-axis here, we can see where it hits the curve right here. This is in the middle of the curve. It is not top or bottom. Therefore, this must be a sine function, okay? Then we got to determine, is it positive or negative? Well, from the y-axis here, it's going up, not down. And therefore, it's a positive sine function because the positive sine function starts in the middle of the curve at the y-axis and goes up. Then it goes down and then up. So this is a positive sine function. Now we want to know what the vertical shift is, okay? Well, we know that this is the middle of the curve, but we could also find the middle of the curve over here. Here's a high point, here's a low point. This is halfway between. And you can see that the middle of the curve is at -1. Therefore, it's 1 unit down from the x-axis. Therefore, this is going to be sine of x minus 1, okay? Now we need to know the amplitude. The highest point here is 2. You can see the highest point of the curve is at 2. The lowest point in the curve is at -4. 2 minus -4 is 6. Divide 6 by 2, and we get 3. Therefore, the amplitude of this curve is 3. So it's 3 sine of x minus 1, okay? Last thing we need to know is what is the frequency? Well, starting at the y-axis, here's 0, and here's 2 pi over here, okay? Well, here's where it starts at -1, and then it goes up to -1, then up to -1 again. How many times did it cycle between 0 and 2 pi? Well, it went once and twice. Therefore, the frequency is 2. Therefore, that's a 2x in the parentheses. So this is 3 sine of 2x minus 1. All right, so I'm going to bring this thing in the side, and we can sure enough see here, y equals 3 sine of 2x minus 1. Okay, let's try another one. All right, here's another one. Why don't you pause the video and see if you can figure this one out on your own? All right, so let's see what we got here. First thing we need to know is it a sine or a cosine, and is it positive or negative? If we go to the y-axis right here, we can see that the y-axis hits the curve here at a low point in the curve, right? This is a low point. That means it can't be the sine function because it always hits the sine function in the middle of the curve. That makes this a cosine function. But the cosine function normally starts out at the top. This y-axis is hitting this cosine function at the bottom. Therefore, this must be a negative cosine function. So this is going to be negative cosine of x. Now let's find our vertical shift. All right, well, if we go from here, this low point, up to this high point, what's halfway between -2 and 6? Well, halfway is probably right about here. So this line right here looks like the halfway point, the middle of the curve, and it's at +2. It's 2 units up from the x-axis. So that means that this curve has been shifted up to 2 units. So this is negative cosine of x plus 2, okay? All right, what is the amplitude? What's the number we're going to put in front of the negative cosine, okay, or in front of cosine? Well, our high point here is 6. The highest point is at 6. The lowest point is at -2. 6 minus -2 is 8, because it becomes, minus negative means plus. So it's 6 plus 2 is 8. Divide by 2 is 4. So the amplitude of this curve is 4. Another way to do the amplitude is go to the middle of the curve and count from the middle 2 up to the highest point or down to the lowest point. 1, 2, 3, 4. Or 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so the amplitude is the distance between the middle point and the highest or lowest point. Okay, so this has an amplitude of 4. So instead of negative cosine of x plus 2, it's negative 4 cosine of x plus 2. Last thing we need to do is the frequency. The frequency is how many times does the cosine function cycle. It starts at the bottom. So it goes from the bottom to the top to the bottom. Back to the starting point right here. Okay, that's one cycle. So that's 1 cycle, 2 cycles, 3 cycles, 4 cycles, and 5 cycles at 2 pi. Okay, so this curve has cycled 5 times between 0 and 2 pi. So that means the frequency here is 5. And therefore, this is negative 4 cosine of 5x plus 2. Let's check it out. There it is. Y equals negative 4 cosine of 5x plus 2. Let's do maybe one more example, and then I think you should have the hang of this. All right, so this one looks a little weird. Let's look at our graph here, our scale. Here's the x-axis, here's the y-axis. We're going up 1, 2, 3, 4, down negative 1, negative 2, okay? Let's find out whether this is a sine or cosine and whether it's positive or negative. Well, here's the y-axis, and it hits this curve in the middle of the curve. It's not a high point or a low point, so this must be a sine function. Also, from the y-axis, it's going downward instead of upward. That makes this a negative sine function. Okay, so this is definitely negative sine. All right, now let's find out the vertical shift. Okay, well, here's the middle of the curve, and it just so happens I'm seeing that the middle of the curve is right at 3, right? So that means that's 3 units up from the x-axis, so that's plus 1, plus 2, plus 3. So this must be negative sine of x plus 3. All right, what about the amplitude? Well, the amplitude is sort of weird here because when we look at the highest point does not go up to 4. It's between 3 and 4. It looks like 3.5, so 3.5. So then we're going to subtract what's the low point here. The low point looks like 2.5. Well, 3.5 minus 2.5 is 1. But then we have to divide by 2. So that's 1/2. So it looks like the amplitude of this thing is 1/2. So instead of negative sine of x plus 3, it's going to be negative 1/2 or 0.5. Negative 0.5 sine of x plus 3. Last thing we need is the frequency. So how many times does it do a full cycle between 0 and all the way over here at 2 pi? Okay, so from here all the way over to here, how many times does it do its cycle? Well, one cycle goes from 0 and it goes down to negative 1, up to positive 1, then back to 0. That's one cycle. Here to here to here. So that's once. Down, up, down. That's twice. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So this has a frequency of 7. So the equation of this curve is going to be negative 0.5 sine of 7x plus 3. Okay, let's check it out. Sure enough, y equals negative 0.5 sine of 7x plus 3. That's it. So we have identified, we've done 3 examples here where you identify the curve. I need you to be able to do that with sine and cosine. That's the last thing we're going to learn in this particular lesson. And then after this, we are going to move on to, other subjects. We're going to move away from trigonometry just for a little while.